I would just like to say thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to this one. I'm sure all of you are joining us because you know of Aidan. Aidan's are you the chair of RAMASES? Aidan?
I'm the president.
Oh, that sounds a bit more fancy, doesn't it? The president of the RAMASES group. So this is going to be an extra special session, and Hatshepsut and Senenmut are always a very interesting subject. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. And as I said before, this is going to be recorded, so I'll send you all a link to the recording after this event. And we've had Aidan on a couple of times on the Explorers Egyptology YouTube channel before. So if anyone wants to check those out, I can post a link into the chat box a bit later on. So Aidan, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Righty-ho, thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Greetings to all RAMASES members and also to those who are coming as guests. Okay, let's see if I can get the usual ritual of getting the sharing screen. Right, okay. There we go. Let me just do. Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see everybody here this afternoon. And what I want to do is talk about the funerary monuments of the two individuals on screen here for a number of different reasons. Both, of course, the individuals themselves are fascinating ones, perennials, hardy perennials when we're talking about Egyptology, but also in the funerary world, both them complexes of material are amongst the earliest, or contain some of the earliest examples of certain items, and so therefore that makes them even more worthwhile to look at. Anyway, right, let us push on. First of all, I'm sure most of you are pretty well aware of how Western Thebes, which is of course where we're going to be this afternoon, hangs together. It's always just worthwhile just reminding people. This is a 1960s aerial photograph of Western Thebes. But with certain, it hasn't changed vastly. But so what we've got here is the edge of the cultivation. We've got the Der el-Bahri Bay there with the temple of Hatshepsut. Here we've got the Sheikh Abdel Kerner Hill, which is where the tomb chapel of Senenmut is, of course, alongside many of the other major figures of this period.
Aidan, I think that maybe your show isn't moving on. Are you showing us different sides?
Yeah, you should be on. Yeah, you should be on slide 2.
No, you're just showing us your sort of keynote file.
Right. Okay. Let me. In which case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out of it and go back into it again, because it's. Okay, just stop that a second. Let me go back into.
New puppy alert.
Oh, so cute. Oh, what kind of puppy is that, Gwyn?
He is an Australian Shepherd, and Aidan, I do apologize. I lost my boy in January, and this one is 8 weeks old. Australian Shepherd, and we're going to be a therapy dog.
Oh, adorable.
Right. Excellent stuff. Right, let me just. Okay, I'm just resetting from scratch, so that sort of hopefully will make it behave itself.
Okay, thank you, and I'll disappear again.
Right, let me now try sharing screen again. There it is. Share. Okay, I'm going to go straight. Has it changed now?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, yeah, computers move in mysterious ways. So, okay, as I was saying, I'm about to try that again because I was obviously just talking, pointing at things which I could see but nobody else could. So look at this aerial photograph of the Theban necropolis. Here we've got the bay of Der el-Bahri with the temples of Montuhotep II and Hatshepsut. Here we've got the Sheikh Abdelkerner Hill with the tomb chapel of Senenmut, and a couple of other things just to point out from this era. Here we've got the memorial temple of Thutmose III, just here. And so very much this area is the Thutmose III stroke Hatshepsut part of the necropolis. And also up here, we have got the so-called southern wadis, which are also of interest here, because that is where Hatshepsut has her tomb when she is serving as regent for Thutmose III. And this is really where we're going to start off. Now, again, I'm sure this is very much telling grandmothers how to suck eggs, but it's always just worth underlining the way that the history works at this period, that Thutmose II dies, leaving a young underage son, and his wife, his sister wife, Hatshepsut, then becomes regent for 7 years, after which she then is promoted to full-scale female pharaoh. And during that period as regent, she constructs a tomb here out in the southern, so-called southern wadis of the Western Thebes. It's possible that Thutmose II may have had his tomb out here as well. The tomb, which is often regarded as his in the Valley of the Kings, there is no proof it is his at all. And in fact, quite a bit of good arguments for it not being his after all. And one thing we do notice is the way that during the early 18th dynasty, the memorial temples of kings align with the tombs of those kings. We see this if you draw a line through the axis of the Der el-Bahri temple of Hatshepsut. You also see that with the temples of Amenhotep II and Thutmose III, all of which clearly aim at the general area of their tombs further into the Theban hills. And on the basis of this, given that we lack a definite tomb of Thutmose II, and his temple, memorial temple, is down here at Medinet Habu, one might possibly guess that his tomb is somewhere along this axis here, which runs interestingly through the Valley of the Queens as well. But also, as we go further west here, we have the tomb of Hatshepsut as regent, though whether it was possibly begun for her as the wife of Thutmose II is we don't know. Also out here is a tomb which has been attributed on the basis of a graffito on a nearby rock to Nefertiti, the daughter of Thutmose II and Hatshepsut, although we can't be absolutely sure about that, although the design is such that it must belong to this kind of period. And also here are the 3 foreign wives of Thutmose III are also out in this area. So this is sort of the area before places like the Valley of the Queens and the Valley of the Kings really get going. And from the point of view of today's discussion, here we have the tomb of Hatshepsut as regent in the Wadi Sika Taka Izeda. And here it is. It's in a bay in the rock at the end of this wadi. And like quite a few tombs of the general period, it was built at the bottom of a chimney in the rock, a natural chimney in the rock. The idea being that after a burial, any flash floods would bring debris crashing down here to completely seal the tomb at the very, very bottom. Similar kind of location is to be found with a number of other early 18th dynasty royal tombs. In the case of Hatshepsut, this is the tomb as found by Howard Carter, or at least found by local plunderers and then taken over by Howard Carter during the First World War. And it takes the form of a tomb of this kind of angled plan, completely undecorated, also unfinished. This room was never completed. But found in the tomb was the sarcophagus of Hatshepsut, which allows us to attribute it to her. Here is the tomb in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Not sure whether it's going to be one of those being moved to the gem or not. There's some, it's still sort of some confusion exactly what's going, or at least last time I spoke to anybody. And of course, having not been into Egypt for 18 months, it's difficult to try and get the exact rules. But anyway, this is the sarcophagus of Hatshepsut as regent, and it really is quite important, and it stands right at the very beginning of the developmental sequence of royal sarcophagi during the New Kingdom. It is quartzite, which is the standard material, at least down until we get just before the Amarna period. And its design is very simple. In fact, everything about it really makes it simply a stone version of a typical Middle Kingdom coffin, with an eye panel on one side, and also offering formula round the top, and then protective formulae vertically there as well. In Middle Kingdom times, when this was, in fact, late Old Kingdom times, when this kind of a container was designed, the body lay on its left-hand side and could see out through this eye panel. By the middle of the Second Intermediate period, bodies had started lying on their backs in their sarcophagi. However, this eye panel had become a time-hallowed element, and therefore continues in place. And we find it going right the way through ultimately to Roman times in various forms. So it's a very important part of the of it. But she kicks the whole thing off, and it's not much larger than enough to hold a human body. As we follow through the history of the sarcophagus, royal sarcophagus during the 18th and 19th dynasties, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But this time it's small but perfectly formed. Now, we've just been down here in the southwestern Wadis, but the main focus of Hatshepsut's burial, once she transitions from regent to being king, lies in the area of Deir el-Bahri. And here we are looking down the Asasif, which is the valley leading up to Deir el-Bahri, with the temple of Hatshepsut on the right, and the temple of Montuhotep II on the left. And in between, just here, is the later temple of Thutmose III. Not a memorial temple like Hatshepsut's, but one associated probably with the beautiful feast of the valley. And here in the foreground, we've got the tomb of Shoshenq, one of the late Third Intermediate period individuals. And with more of them, with the temple of tomb of Montuhotep and so on in the middle ground. And here we've got looking down at the overall Deir el-Bahri area, with the temples of the kings at the end here. These are various tombs of Middle Kingdom notables, and superimposed on that some of these late Third Intermediate / late period tombs. The unfinished memorial temple of Ramases IV and VI down here. And down here, we have got the valley building of Hatshepsut. Unlike all later memorial temples of the New Kingdom, as far as we can tell anyway, Hatshepsut's follows the pattern of the Old and Middle Kingdoms in having not only the temple itself, but also a portal, a valley temple, a valley building, which is at the beginning of the causeway leading up to the temple, possibly because Hatshepsut's temple is much deeper into the desert than those of most of her successors. So that may have been a reason to have a sort of portal here on the edge. And then you have the causeway running through up to the temple itself. And an aerial photograph here showing the three temples, Montuhotep, Hatshepsut, and then Thutmose III up here. And the distinctive forms of these tombs, these temples, these distinctive forms with the series of terraces. And it seems quite clear that the architect of the temple of Hatshepsut, probably Senenmut, but we can't be absolutely certain about that, did model the temple in many ways on that of Montuhotep, although there are examples of terraced temples against cliffs in between that time. So one can't, there's probably quite a close inspiration here, but one can't say it's a one-for-one copy in those terms. Now, this is but before Hatshepsut builds her temple at Deir el-Bahri, it's important to recognize that there are earlier phases. We already mentioned the Montuhotep II memorial temple, 11th dynasty, but before the northern part of Deir el-Bahri was transformed by the addition of Hatshepsut's temple, Amenhotep I built a brick temple in that area, and here we can see it marked out here. Amenhotep I, although his actual tomb is probably at Drabul Naga and further to the north, and actually his definitive memorial temple is in front of Drabul Naga, quite closely linked with that, with that tomb. He also has an affinity with Deir el-Bahri. In particular, his wife, Meritamun, is buried here in Theban tomb 358, and recent research by David Aston has suggested pretty strongly that the tomb of his mother, Ahmes Nefertiti, the wife of Thutmose, is none other than the same tomb as the royal cache, which lies to the south here, Theban tomb 320, which lies a few hundred yards off there. So in which case this temple of Amenhotep, whether it is his memorial temple or something else, is closely linked with the tombs of his mother and his wife. And initially it seems that when Hatshepsut builds her temple here, she doesn't actually, she leaves this in place. It's also possible that Thutmose I, whose memorial temple remains unknown, could also have built his temple here. There is a space here which would fit something quite neatly. And also, when we look in a moment at the foundation deposits of Hatshepsut, it may be that she was originally taking over a structure of Thutmose I, because the foundation deposits, or at least the first set of foundation deposits added here by Hatshepsut, do not line up with the definitive temple, but they do line up with the orientation of Amenhotep I's temple and this putative one of Thutmose I. So here you've got Amenhotep I's temple. And this is all that survives of it. It was built of mud brick, and its traces were discovered when the lower terrace of Hatshepsut's temple was dismantled during the 1920s for consolidation work. And so there it is. Now, I mentioned Hatshepsut foundation deposits, and there is a reconstruction of one of them in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which discovered the majority of them. But their layout is quite interesting because the one group of them are most certainly not particularly well oriented as far as the definitive temple is concerned. Indeed, one of them is on the axis of the Amenhotep I temple, and these four running across here are actually at right angles to it. So it does suggest that the original idea was that the temple would not be where it is, parallel with Montuhotep's, but actually angled towards it, presumably to reduce the amount of grading and other topographical work needed to actually do this, because this wall here, which is Montuhotep II's wall, actually marks the edge of the bedrock around here. So to build the temple back here required a certain amount of effort. So what's possible, and we can't prove this, is that Thutmose I begins a temple here. It's then taken over by Hatshepsut, who adds, presumably probably to be enlarged, who adds these foundation deposits before rethinking things completely and producing the definitive version of the temple. And the idea that Thutmose I's temple, or beginnings of which were overbuilt by Hatshepsut, would be an explanation as to why there is a memorial chapel of his in the definitive temple, as well as Hatshepsut. I'll be coming back to that in a moment. So that's what I'm suggesting, is that there may have been a temple begun there, which was then taken over by Hatshepsut. But then, a change of plan is that there's another set of foundation deposits which do actually line up with the definitive axis. But interestingly, where they lie suggests that initially that Amenhotep I's temple might have been left be, and it was only later on that a further enlargement of the temple required its demolition. And that's possibly when his cult gets moved to this other temple in front of Drabal Naga, which I was mentioning. So on that sort of basis, one might suggest that initially this is how the temple was supposed to be, only the upper part of it with a ramp terminating here, allowing the Amenhotep I temple to remain intact. But then the recognition that this messed up the processional way, and Egyptian ritual structures are always quite keen on ensuring that there is a proper processional route to things, meant that the temple of Amenhotep I was demolished. And the final phase, which we all recognise, is what then is produced. And there we have again, this time viewed from the south, looking at the way that the series of terraces rise up from front to back. And another general view of the whole thing, showing the importance of the way of this kind of axial processional routes in Egyptian architecture. Anyway, now let's have a little look at a little tour of the temple and see what we've got here. Now, the reason why the Hatshepsut temple is so important is not simply because it looks so pretty, it's because it's by far the best preserved of any memorial temple of the 18th dynasty. In fact, pretty well all the other ones are totally trashed, and therefore we have the existence of the Hatshepsut temple allows us to understand what an 18th dynasty memorial temple should be and how it's likely to have been decorated. Because without this, we would know absolutely nothing about 18th dynasty memorial temples, which is possibly dangerous in the sense that Hatshepsut is all we've got, and there's always a danger of reading something which was specific to her as being something which was more general, and also vice versa. And also there's a likelihood that individual kings all had their own tastes on these things. But the importance here is both it as her temple, but also as a model for what other memorial temples, which are now totally trashed, would look like. Anyway, here we are at the lower level. So possibly this lower level was the last part of the temple to be added to the plan, which required the demolition of the Amenhotep I temple, which effectively lay in this area here. And here we can looking at the colonnades. In their current form, the result of restoration carried out first of all in the 1890s by the Egypt Exploration Fund under the direction of Howard Carter, and then more recently under the direction of the Polish expedition, which has been working at el-bahri for a very, very long time. So here we are in the lower northern colonnade, with a lot of the wall now missing. So much of what we interpret of what was going on here is on the basis of the lower courses only. And also, it doesn't help is the fact that many of the reliefs of Hatshepsut were erased under Thutmose III. These erasures seem to have taken place late in Thutmose III's reign, not directly after Hatshepsut's demise, which one might have expected. And the reason for the 20-odd year gap between her disappearance and the erasure of her material remains one of the many mysteries of the period. But we can get a reasonable feel for what's going on here. And particularly here, what we can see here is actually a clump of flowers and reeds in the marshes. And these allow us to know that this was originally a scene of Hatshepsut hunting in the marshes. The sort of scene which we're all familiar with from private tomb chapels of this period, in fact, a scene which goes all the way back to the Old Kingdom, and actually appears to be something which is common to both private and royal individuals, rather than quite so often stated that this kind of hunting and fishing scene is a purely private thing. We've got the remains of one here, and which suggests this was a part of all, at least 18th dynasty memorial temples anyway. And it's important here also to get one's head round correctly the fact that what we're seeing here at Deir el-Bahri is the exact royal equivalent of the private tomb chapels on Sheikh Abdel Kerner, Drabur Naga, and so on. And therefore, the kind of mixture of scenes we find in the private chapels of this period, which is a mixture of ritual, hunting, so-called daily life, and also official life scenes, is exactly the same kind of mixture we have here. It's always important, as I sort of, those of you who've been taught by me in the past will be well aware, is under no circumstances confuse the private tomb chapels with the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. They're a completely different thing. The tomb chapels are the equivalent of the memorial temples. The Valley of the Kings tombs are the substructures of these private tombs. We'll talk a bit more about that when we get to Senenmut, because with him, the equivalences and differences between royal and private practice are quite clear. But anyway, what we've got here is the remains of a hunting and fishing scene of Hatshepsut. So effectively, what we're reconstructing here effectively is like Neber Moon's one in the British Museum. So this area here, can you see the various plants? That's what we've got in the middle here. So you'd have had Hatshepsut on the right here, using a boomerang to knock down birds, and probably on the other side, a parallel one showing her fishing with a spear. And just looking at closely here again, we can just see the tops of the Pyrus umbels here with all these birds and so on. And those of you who've been to Beni Hassan will recognize this kind of bird heavy imagery when you're looking at these hunting and fishing in the marshes scenes, which I say are ubiquitous and are something which this shows are both in private and royal examples. The southern part of the colonnade here with this is actually with roofing added by Howard Carter, working for the EEF in the 1890s. Well, here we've got other other kinds of scenes here, which, in particular, the transport of the obelisks, which are the scenes which we can see along the top here. So here we've got on one side of these colonnades sort of sporting, and on this side official acts by Hatshepsut. The extremely low relief of these makes it very, very difficult to see things properly using in photography. And even when you're standing in front of the wall, it's often very, very difficult to pick out exactly what's going on. Let's say anyway, those are the that is the obelisk transport scenes. And in fact, the obelisk you can just about see on lashed to the barge up here, and here are some of the accompanying boats and towboats. Moving on up to the next terrace, we see at the far end here the entrance to a chapel of Anubis. Here, an unfinished colonnade, and directly behind here is the tomb of Queen Meritamun, the wife of Amenhotep I. The North Colonnade on this level has the famous scenes of divine birth, and this is the element of it showing the moment of conception when Thutmose, the wife of Thutmose I, is in intimate surroundings, shall we say, with Amun, who at the moment of conception has become embodied in her earthly husband, Thutmose I. You can just about see them here. Here the two figures, Thutmose here, Amun over. Sorry, which one's which? Anyway, the two there we are, Amun on this side, Thutmose on this side, being held up by goddesses. And you can just about see some of the outlines of it. Now, another sort of myth has often been that the presence of the divine birth scenes here is a question of Hatshepsut protesting too much. She always tries to justify her anomalous taking of kingship alongside her stepson Thutmose III. And as this was one of the first of these scenes to be discovered, 2 and 2 was put together, and it was assumed that she'd almost made this particular whole thing up to try and justify her position. Later on, other examples have been found, and because scholars had come to the conclusion this was all Hatshepsut protesting too much, they then read a similar kind of thing into other examples. For example, that of Amenhotep III. With coming up with all kinds of weird and wonderful theories to suggest that he regarded himself in some way as of doubtful legitimacy. In fact, we're now discovering that these scenes are absolutely bog standard. They found some in the memorial temple of Senenmut III at Abydos in the 12th dynasty. There's examples of these scenes in temples of Taharqa of the 25th dynasty. We've got fragments of those of Ramases II. So actually, it looks like this is, again, an absolutely bog standard thing, which would appear in any kind of temple closely related to a given king, particularly their memorial temple like this. So this sequence is now no longer the earliest of them, and so rather than being some kind of indication of Hatshepsut trying to bolster her position, she is simply using a sequence which is has been standard in this kind of temple going back to the Middle Kingdom. The only problem being that so many of the temples have been totally trashed that we don't have the link. But very usefully, this discovery at Abydos has helped push the whole thing back way into the 12th dynasty. And here, it's in reasonably good condition. We have parts of the sequence, the divine birth sequence. There's the conception we've just looked at. Here is the Annunciation, where Thoth tells Thutmose that she is going to have a baby, and that baby is going to be king. Then we have her being led to the birth chamber with a very discreet but noticeable baby bump. And there we have the nursing of the child after its birth. The sequence is damaged, but a reasonable chunk of it, as we can see here, survives. And we have more of deities nursing the child as future Hatshepsut. So also on this level, we've got this chapel of Anubis, one of 2 Anubis chapels in the complex. And here we've just got a few views of it. Here, as elsewhere in the temple, Hatshepsut's images have been largely destroyed, and likewise her names. There's a mixture of what happens. In some cases, it's simply erased and left. In others, the figures are relabeled as those of either Thutmose I or Thutmose II. Rarely Thutmose III, where he, in particular, because Thutmose III does actually appear quite frequently in the temple at Deir el-Bahri as Hatshepsut's sidekick. Another sort of myth is that Hatshepsut sort of pushes Thutmose III off into the margins. And certainly, although he certainly is not as prominent as he might otherwise have been, very, very frequently, Hatshepsut makes it quite clear that she and him are co-rulers. And here we've just got a few close-ups of some of the painted reliefs in the chapel. Unlike certain other parts, the paint is in very good condition, so therefore the extremely low relief is much more visible than it is in some of the colonnades where the paint has gone, and therefore we can only, as we saw in those earlier slides, only just about see them. Moving on to the other side of the second level, you've got a further colonnade, but also here you've got a chapel of Hathor. Hathor becomes the major deity in Deir el-Bahri, and all three of the temples here have Hathoric connections and installations. The south colonnade, the one which you just see there, has the famous punt reliefs. So this one is made up of a whole sequence relating to Hatshepsut's trading expedition to Punt somewhere in East Africa, possibly somewhere in the current views, somewhere in the region of modern Port Sudan, or possibly a bit further south. Very, very difficult to photograph. This actually is a cast of the reliefs in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. And even then, very difficult to capture. And because of the columns in the real thing, very, very difficult to do anything with, even when you're actually there. I've spent sort of whole days trying to get sort of a photo mosaic, which works, and failed abysmally. So all we get is, I will show is a few little snapshots and also some of the beautiful drawings done by Howard Carter and his team in the 1890s. Most famously, the arrival scene with the Egyptian delegation being met by the Queen of Punt and her husband here. And this is the wall in question. So very difficult to photograph particularly well. Hence, these drawings an absolute boon. Then, alongside that, we have the Hathor chapel. So she then becomes very much the patroness, and most of the later cults we find at Deir el-Bahri are all around her. And a few little details here, including this wonderful one of the Hathor cow licking the hand of Hatshepsut on the facade. And here we are right in the back of it. And the cartouches here are Hatshepsut on one side and Thutmose III on the other, showing the duality of the co-rule between the two of them. And then moving up, we get into the business part of the temple in many ways, which is the area of the actual major cults. So what we have effectively is the lower levels here are all to do with Hatshepsut almost in her human form, in the sense you've got this one is the fowling scenes, the obelisk there, you've then got divine birth, you've then got the Punt expedition here. And then as we go up to the upper level, we have got the actual cults. Now, I've been calling this temple a memorial temple throughout this lecture so far, rather than a mortuary temple, because there is a significant difference between the temples of the New Kingdom, as seen in Hatshepsut's case, and those of earlier periods. In earlier periods, the temples associated with royal tombs, effectively the pyramids, are the sanctuary is that of the dead king, and it's to his cult the whole thing is is devoted. That's not the case when we get to the New Kingdom, because when you go to the top and go through into the central sanctuary, which we can just see the entrance of here, this is not dedicated to the dead king. This is not for Hatshepsut. This is actually for the god Amun, specifically the god Amun of Djeser Djeseru being the name of the Deir el-Bahri region. So we have that there. And then it's over the king's mortuary installation is off to the left here. So you've got the main axis is for Amun, the king is off to the left, and there's also a further axis over here for Reharakti. So there's a tripartite division of these temples, which isn't the case in pre-New Kingdom temples associated with a royal funerary installation. So we have Amun, the king, and Reharakti, with the king in some ways almost being the junior partner in all this. Here we are going into the Holy of Holies, the Amun sanctuary here. It's not to say that the king is in any way missing. He and she, because we've got both Hatshepsut and Thutmose III visible here, are shown in offering pose, and in fact also we've got Osirid statues, presumably of each of them, or possibly just of Hatshepsut. We don't know, but we've got those here. Interestingly, the very back of the Amun sanctuary was cut away in Ptolemaic times and became a chapel for the deified Imhotep and Amenhotep, son of Harpu. So the central axis is of Amun, and then we have the solar court dedicated to Reharakti on this side. So these features are something which you'll find in all later royal memorial temples of the New Kingdom. And then over here we have the royal complex. In this case, comprising both Hatshepsut and Thutmose I. But it's possible that Thutmose I's presence here is because his original sanctuary had been appropriated, or at least the site of it had been appropriated when the Hatshepsut temple was created. I used to think that this was having a shrine for the dead king's father was a standard feature, because we also find it at the temple of Seti I at Kurna, which is the only other New Kingdom, the only other memorial temple from the earlier first half of the New Kingdom which has got that part preserved. However, recent work at Kurna has suggested that that temple may have been originally started for Ramases I, and that Seti I had taken it over. So therefore, the presence of a chapel for both Seti I and Ramases I in the same place may have been because of this need to provide some kind of sort of a cult location for a king who hadn't got it, and that may be the case here as well. Because also it's worthwhile noting that the only other New Kingdom memorial temple with the cult part intact of Ramases III has no trace of any provision for Setnakti, his father, and it's quite clear that Ramases III had a lot of time for his father. So the fact there's not in that particular case suggests these two other ones are anomalous. It's just unfortunate because they're the only two intact ones with that part of the temple intact. It may mislead you to think that this is standard when it actually isn't. But anyway, so we have the chapel of Hatshepsut herself here with a great false door at one end, and the side walls with conventional offering formulae. As you can see here, Hatshepsut's figure has been hacked out. And next door in the chapel of Thutmose I, we have his stela as well. So that's the tripartite division of the back of the temple. Now then, the temple at Deir el-Bahri is part of the overall funerary installation of Hatshepsut. But of course, the other part is her actual burial place, and that lay in the Valley of the Kings. And the tomb in which she was buried lay pretty well on the axis of the main temple. In fact, the tomb is just over here. It doesn't quite line up, but it's, you know, given pre-modern surveying, it's pretty good. Here we've got a view of the Valley of the Kings. Most of the tombs here are much later ones, Ramesside ones, with great openings into the side of the cliffs. However, earlier kings, as I mentioned earlier on, have tombs in much more discreet locations at the bottom of a chimney in the rock, and that's the case here. It's the tomb of Amenhotep II, for example. The choice of the Valley of the Kings may have been influenced by a number of things, partly the convenience for regarding where the memorial temples were going to be, but also possibly because of the pyramidal peak, El Kern, which stood above it, because one of the great innovations of the New Kingdom is the abandonment of the royal pyramid. Thutmose I had one at Abydos, but no subsequent king does until 25th dynasty. Possibly this may be a practical thing in the sense that the terrain on the West Bank at Thebes isn't conducive to big pyramids, but there also may well have been the desire for much more of a level of security provided by not building a pyramid over the top of the royal tomb. Anyway, down in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb in which Hatshepsut's material was found is here, KV20. Whether this tomb was originally founded for Hatshepsut or whether or not she took it over from Thutmose I is one of the various matters of debate for this period. There has been a much of a ding-dong regarding it. And certainly if Thutmose I really did have a temple, a proto-temple at Deir el-Bahri, that would reinforce the idea that this might actually have been started for him. There are foundation deposits of Hatshepsut were found outside, but foundation deposits can also simply reflect a taking over of somebody else's monument rather than saying it was definitely the one you built for them yourself. It's in this corner here with tomb of Thutmose IV here, the 20th dynasty tomb of Prince Montuhur Kopchef here, and here at the bottom of this chimney in the rock is the tomb of Hatshepsut herself. And there we can just see the bottom of it. This is the entrance. This is Montuhur Kopchef's tomb. And all this is actually debris dug out of the tomb when it was cleared by Carter in the early 20th century, because most of the tomb had been filled up with flood-borne debris. Just looking at the tomb into the context of the period, it does seem to mark the end of a sequence, because we've got these very sinuous tombs of Thutmose I and also probably Ahmes Nefertiti here, but then later on the tombs become much more regularized down here. But that's KV20. It is a very strange tomb in the way it bends. This has generally been attributed to the fact that the bedrock is fairly rubbish here, and the original intention had been to drive it straight ahead, which would have taken the burial chamber very much underneath the cliffs directly behind Deir el-Bahri, rather than having to come round in this broad, in this sweeping form, which it ultimately took. So there we have it going down there. So that is roughly straight. That is straight through to Deir el-Bahri. So it then veers off quite badly. And so the best explanation is the builder trying to get decent rock which they're failing to do. One of the things which suggests that the tomb might have something, have been Thutmose the first, is the fact that when you look at compare the burial chamber of the probable tomb of Amenhotep I with that of KV20, the proportions are identical. And in fact, if you didn't have the additional column, the third column, the whole thing would be absolutely exactly the same proportions. So this might suggest that these two burial chambers were built in successive reigns rather than there with a gap in between. But given that we don't have a definite tomb of Thutmose II, it's quite possible that this kind of proportionality marches on between the two. But it's an interesting sort of point of, it's a rather suggestive point anyway. The tomb is the first to have a decorated interior since the Old Kingdom, as far as royal kings' tombs are concerned. And because of the poor quality rock, it wasn't possible to plaster and decorate the burial chamber directly. But a series of limestone slabs were lined the chamber, which were then used as the basis for a copy of the Book of Amduat, which is the first of the great underworld books of the New Kingdom, which follows the sun god through the 12 hours of the night, which is regarded as being a metaphor for the rebirth of the dead king. And here we've just got some surviving fragments of it. Much better preserved is a copy produced around the same sort of time for the decoration of the tomb of Thutmose III. But this stands right at the very beginning of the evolution of the Book of Amduat, which becomes which is standard for kings up to the Amarna period and continues to appear in royal tombs right the way through until the end of the Ramesside period. And then after that becomes part of the funerary papyri, which are used by private individuals. This is a watercolour of the burial chamber as discovered by Carter, showing debris and so on, and showing one of the sarcophagi found in the burial chamber. In fact, that's where this view is taken from. And so what we can see there is the sarcophagus of Hatshepsut herself with the thrown off lid. Not visible in the painting is her canopic chest, which is just here. These are the items in question, both made of quartzite. The sarcophagus is a logical enlargement of the sequence begun by the one in Sekhet Ezid, although with more elaborate texts, and also rather than just simply having protective texts, also depictions of the relevant protective deities also placed on it. It's also in the form of a cartouche. The rounded end here isn't quite really visible on this photograph. And this is the canopic chest, also made of quartzite to match the sarcophagus. And that's useful to way a comparison of the size of her original regent's sarcophagus as compared with what's only a few years later. And say the size of sarcophagi jumps exponentially each time through each of the reigns. Not much else of the funerary equipment has been found. A couple of shabtis of Hatshepsut survive. This is the one which I've actually seen in the flesh in The Hague, in the Netherlands. Again, this is the second oldest royal shabti we know of, the oldest being one of Thutmose in the British Museum. Now, in addition to the sarcophagus and canopic chest of Hatshepsut, the burial chamber also has a sarcophagus which had been adapted by Hatshepsut for her father, Thutmose I. So who may already have had this tomb, and possibly to make up for having nicked her father's tomb, she provides him with a stone sarcophagus, because there's no evidence of stone sarcophagi for kings of the New Kingdom prior to the time of Hatshepsut. This sarcophagus, which was later emptied when Thutmose I was taken away and reburied by Thutmose III in another tomb, is interesting because it was originally made for Hatshepsut, but then modified for her father, and then a new final sarcophagus created for Hatshepsut, the one which we've just been talking about. Here it is. It's now in Boston, Museum of Fine Arts. It's actually a rectangular one, and there's these sort of missing link in some ways between Hatshepsut's one as regent and her definitive one, because it's rectangular, bit bigger, with the texts enhanced by the addition of the figures of deities. The sarcophagus had been made for Hatshepsut, but all the exterior decoration had been shaved off and completely redone for Thutmose I. Although other parts of the sarcophagus were not reworked, only the cartouches were altered. Presumably this was done on the outside because it would be too obvious to fill in the cartouches and then rework them. Also, a dedication text was added by Hatshepsut, stating that she's giving this to her father. And that's the text there, which is this one, which is, I'm not sure why the top of it's chopped off. It looked okay originally. But basically it's saying that she made it as a monument for her father. This is using the standard kind of text for this kind of gifting in Egypt. And there's a couple of diagrams just showing the way that the sarcophagus was modified for Thutmose I. It's very good. These are nicked from an article in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology some years ago, which looked at the mechanics of the conversion of the temple. One thing that was interesting is that you see here that actually they clearly had modified the sarcophagus. And here you can see neatly how the first outer centimetre or so has been shaved off. This is the original text, which went down the centre of each of them. But this cutout here is because clearly nobody had bothered to measure the coffin of Thutmose I when they were when they took the sarcophagus over. Presumably it stayed in the tomb until the sarcophagus arrived, at which point they realised they couldn't get it in and had to start hacking a few inches out of one end to get the coffin to actually fit. And this is it, that they've had to cut a whole bit out there, and then also just try and roughly put the decoration back in, because this is the original coffin of Thutmose I, later usurped by Pinagem I and found in the royal cache. There's a number of other similar examples of people not measuring things properly. For example, the toes of the outer coffin of Tutankhamun had to be sawn off because the sarcophagus wouldn't close when they had it all together. As for the fate of Hatshepsut, we know very, very little. All one can say is that she wasn't in the tomb. Some fragments of her coffin turned up in the tomb of Ramases XI, which seems to have been used as a workshop for those who were stripping some of the royal burials in the late New Kingdom, early Third Intermediate period. As many of you are aware, it has been proclaimed that this mummy here is that of Hatshepsut, and actually has been transferred to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization under her name. This is all on the basis of a tooth found in this box from Theban tomb 320, which bears Hatshepsut's name, but also contains a probably later mummified organ of some description. And CAT scans allege that the tooth fits exactly in a cavity in the face of this mummy, which was found in tomb KV60, just outside KV20. However, it does appear that when one scratches the surface of this great discovery, the match may not be absolutely exact. And depending on whose account you read, it becomes less and less of a fit. Also, the fact that the tooth was found in a box bearing Hatshepsut's name says very little about the origins of the tooth. You could say if you found a tooth in a coronation biscuit tin, it was a tooth of Queen Elizabeth II, using exactly the same kind of logic. So the links are very, very poor. Also, since this proclamation was made, fragments from KV60 have been cleaned, and including part of the coffin of a commoner woman, a singer or a nurse. And given that there was also in the same tomb a coffin and mummy of another nurse, it seems like this mummy is simply that of another of these nurses who were buried together here. So I think that the likelihood of this being Hatshepsut is verging on zero. On the other hand, though, given that the Egyptians believed that putting a name on something gave it some sort of standing, it probably means that, at least theologically, this mummy is Hatshepsut's, and if her Ka wished to inhabit it, she probably could get away with it without having too much of a fight with the real owner's Ka. Now, that is that's part one, looking at Hatshepsut. The other great figure of the reign was Senenmut, who was overseer of works and has often been proclaimed to be the architect of el-bahri. Whether that is the case or not, we can't be certain, but clearly closely associated with it, and also often has been put up as being the potential life partner of Hatshepsut. And in fact, when we look at their funerary material, one can possibly support that latter idea, but I'll be coming back to that shortly. First of all, let's just have a look and see what we actually have for the funerary outfit of Senenmut. This is the area we're talking about, and this is quite an old aerial photograph because many of the houses on the lower slopes of Sheikh Abdel Kern, which have now been demolished, can be seen there. But here on the top of the hill is where we find the tomb chapel of Senenmut, Theban tomb 71. It's one of quite a number of tombs at the very, very top of the hill, which was clearly the place to be seen dead in during the 18th dynasty, and not only to be seen but also to see, because it becomes very, very clear when one looks at where tombs, temples and so on the West Bank, is they are all intended to have a view or interact with the processional routes on the West Bank, particularly that of the beautiful Feast of the Valley, one of the festivals during which the bark of Ammon comes across from Karnak to the West Bank and tours around. And one of the places it does go is Deir el-Bahri, but also then along the front. And therefore, having a tomb up here allows you posthumously to participate in that festival. as well as the general concepts of having a view. And certainly also it's quite important with things for there to be a line of sight to Karnak as well, all of which is possible from this position high up on the Sheikh Abdel Kerner hill. And this is the area we are talking about at the very, very top here. With Senenmut in the middle here. Also, this tomb of Ray is also of this kind of date. Very interesting because you can see where he got the idea for his architecture from, can't you? That is very much a mini Der el-Bahri. Over and down here, you've actually got the upper part of the Vizier Ussa, who was the vizier during the latter part, at least part of the reign of Hatshepsut. He serves, possibly continuing service after her death, under her co-regent Thutmose III. So you've got San Ray as part of this. So up here you've got some very distinguished individuals of the reigns of Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and also just over here another distinguished individual, the tomb of Anen, the brother of Queen T, so therefore the brother-in-law of Amenhotep III. So a very distinguished bunch of people up here on the top of the hill. And this is actually the modern shrine of Sheikh Abdel Kerner himself. The tomb of Senenmut, so that part of the cross hall has collapsed, and it's quite interesting in like a number of these early Thutmosid tombs, there are some windows along the front looking into the cross hall. Here is a section of it. So you've got, this is the cross hall here with pillars, and then going back a passageway going to the back of the tomb. And up here we have got a feature which you find in a few other tombs of this general period, a little figure, a seated figure of Senenmut with in the enveloping folds of the block statue, a figure of the Princess Neferu Ray, the daughter of Hatshepsut, and another of Senenmut's key positions was as her tutor. So that's at the top. That's in this little thing at the top here. Now, if we look at the tomb in more detail, here we can see this axonometric view showing here's the facade, cross hall, and the long hall. This is a typical Theban, we call T-shaped tomb of the New Kingdom. So we have a very wide but shallow forehall, and then a part of it stretching back into the rock. And although some of them don't have any kind of pillars, Senenmut's is one of those which does have pillars down the centre of the forehall. And this is looking down that corridor. Most of the decoration has been destroyed, apart from a small amount around the ceiling area. And here we're looking down at the end. Here is a niche. This was originally thought to be an entrance to the substructure of the tomb. It was now recognised, however, that this is actually merely a geological feature of a collapse into into a later tomb below. So this is nothing to do with Senenmut's tomb itself. It's merely, I say, where things have accidentally, where the rock has collapsed, simply because there are too many tombs all trying to cram themselves into this very, very high status area at the top. At the very, very end, which is the point where the interface between the world of the dead and living came, is to be seen here. And like a number of individuals of this general period, same goes for Rekhmi Ray, the vizier of Thutmose III. We have a compound cult arrangement here. So what we've got at the lower level is a quartzite false door stela, now in Berlin. And at the top, there is a niche surrounded by text. And in that niche would have been a small statuette of the deceased. So therefore, you've got two potential interface points, a statue and a stela. It's in many ways a transition because prior to the New Kingdom, it was always a stela. As the New Kingdom goes on, we get increasing numbers of tombs with just a statue as the transition point. And although very, very badly damaged, Peter Dorman, who published the tomb, was able to reconstruct some of the scenes of what's going on in here. In fact, the recipients of the offerings here are not actually the Senenmut himself. It's his parents and two other individuals, possibly his parents again on the other side. We have no evidence for any wife of Senenmut. The walls have been very, very badly damaged, but from the various fragments which survive, and also the parallels, because a lot of these tombs tend to do the same kind of stuff, Peter Dorman was able to recreate these scenes on the walls. What's very odd is these sunken niches with the name of the deceased carved on them. Not clear whether these were meant to sort of be visible or whether these would have been covered over in plaster originally. They're not a feature one regularly finds elsewhere. You see them here on the other side as well, and here you can see them in the damaged wall there. And here's each example of them, all of which have been quite badly mutilated. In fact, dual mutilation, because there's both the erasure of the name of Senenmut himself, which happened sometime either late Hatshepsut or early Thutmose III, and also the name of Ammon, because one of his titles was related to Ammon, and therefore that got hacked out in the Amarna period. So these have suffered quite badly, but beautifully carved. And one thing which was left intact is the name of the parents of Senenmut. Looking at the cross hole, there again, much of it gone, but a few little fragments surviving at roof level. Here we've got a rather famous thing, the remains of some Cretan offering bearers. And there we've also got some soldiers as well. But that's all we've got, but that's all really that survives meaningfully of the decoration of the tomb. And also this rather fine Hathoric frieze as well. Clearly the people who were sent to mutilate the tomb didn't have long enough ladders or couldn't be bothered, so these bits get left behind, these bits were left behind, luckily. Now, so TC71 is here up on the tomb, and if it were like the vast majority of other high status tombs in the area, it would have had a burial chamber underneath it. But that's not universal. I mentioned the tomb of Rekhmire, the vizier of Thutmose III earlier on. He doesn't have a burial chamber under his tomb either, under his chapel either. And it's been suggested he may have actually been buried in the Valley of the Kings, where there's a number of shaft tombs, including at least one which belonged to a vizier of Amenhotep II. So it's not universal that everybody is buried underneath their chapel, and Senenmut was no exception. Although where he had his tomb was somewhat different, shall we say, because the burial element of the tomb is here, with the entrance just outside the Der el-Bahri temple complex. It's often been talked about a first and second tomb, or an original and secret tomb of Senenmut. Again, that misunderstands what's going on. TT71 is the public tomb chapel, which pretty well every major individual had, and even kings had in the equivalence of the memorial temple. Then most had substructures for burial, mainly underneath, but some had them elsewhere, and Senenmut does this. So that's what 353 is. That is the substructure of that one, even though it is quite a distance apart. And given there is no trace of a substructure in 71, there's no reason to believe that they weren't built at the same time. Before we go down to look at that substructure, however, it's worthwhile pointing out that various members of Senenmut's household were buried close to him. These are the excavations in the 1930s in front of the tomb, when the debris filling the courtyard were removed, and we found a number of things were found, including this little burial chamber here, which turned out to be that of the parents of Senenmut. So here we've got a plan of the area. So here is where the that little opening is, but also we have a number of other burials in the radim, or it's in the rubble out here, including a singer, carry with his lute with him. There was a small horse, a number of other burials here as well, all of whom seem to be most likely to be members of the household of Senenmut. And there is Thutmose's coffin on display in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York today. Over here, we have the horse I mentioned. But most importantly, we've got this small chamber which contained the mummies of Senenmut's parents, a man called Ramose and a woman called Hatnofret. And there is the tomb when it was first opened, showing how everything has rather been stuffed into it. And here we've actually got a plan of the tomb. It looks like Ramose had originally been buried elsewhere. He's and then was moved here at the time of Hatnofret's death to join her. His coffin is an earlier type than that of Hatnofret. The mummification is substandard, so it may well be that Ramose has died quite early on, possibly before his son became sort of the second man of the state, and then was transferred here when his wife died. And here we've just got the coffin of Hatnofret when it was first opened, with the mummy inside, with the shroud and the mummy mask, which was over the head. And there we've got the canopic chest of her as well. Her husband has none of this kind of stuff, so suggesting he died quite low status a lot earlier on, but by the time Hatnofret died, the fortunes of the family via Senenmut were such that she could have really quite a spectacular burial. Now, what's one thing I mentioned just now, that the actual tomb chamber is some distance away, but for some reason, the sarcophagus or fragments of the sarcophagus of Senenmut were found in TT 71. These have now been reconstructed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There's still quite a bit missing, but the basic form. But what's fascinating about this is the sarcophagus, although apart from being oval in the sense of having rounded ends rather than being cartouche form like Hatshepsut's, is identical to hers. It's been made in the same workshop. It has the same basic textual arrangements, all those kinds of things, and really can only be described as a his and hers pair of sarcophagi. Now, I alluded earlier on that there's been speculation ever since Senenmut's existence was identified that he may have been Hatshepsut's life partner, which has often been poo-pooed by Egyptologists as being a bit too sort of smacking of Mills and Boone rather than archaeology. However, given his presence in all kinds of places where no commoner would normally be, in the decoration of temples and so on, and the fact that he had a sarcophagus which was identical to the queen, the female kings, I suspect is a bit of a giveaway. thing is, history shows that it's, at least until modern times, it's always slightly problematic to have with, as far as a life partner of a ruling woman is concerned. Just look at Catherine the Great, for example, and the romantic problems that Elizabeth I had. So the very fact there's no, and again, the very fact that Queen Victoria, quite exactly what she did with Prince Albert, all those. So it's always an issue. So I think you wouldn't expect to necessarily, particularly in Egypt, where the idea of a female monarch is a very rare beast. I think trying to find anything explicit about the relationship between Senenmut and Hatshepsut is going to be problematic. But actually, them having his and hers sarcophagi, I think, is a bit of a giveaway. So, pretty well all, when the two are compared, they're clearly made in the same workshop with the same basic kinds of textual thinking going on. So anyway, why the sarcophagus was ended up in TT 71, which doesn't have a burial chamber, but it's right top of the hill as well. So getting it up there must have been a bit of a killer. We have absolutely no idea. However, the intended tomb burial place itself was clearly TT 353 down just outside the temple of Hatshepsut. Now here it is. Here we can see it on the map, just outside the main enclosure. However, the innermost part with the intended burial chamber does actually lie within the overall confines of the temple complex of Hatshepsut, and that again looks like sort of an attempt. Again, he's not going to be buried in the Valley of the Kings. He's not going to be in the same tomb as her, but I think that sort of is a fairly good attempt at getting quite close to that kind of thing. This is the entrance to it. It's in a quarry area just outside the enclosure of Hatshepsut, and this is with a modern arch over it. But from here, the tomb descends very, very rapidly into the rock. This is a photograph taken during the excavations, and one descends at a steep angle through to one chamber here, another chamber here, and then finally down to what seems to be an unfinished burial chamber. Not sure you'd actually get the sarcophagus down here, so there may have been some issues about original plans and plans being changed, but this distance is not much we can really do with that. Here in this niche is this rather famous graffito of Senenmut, presumably sketched by one of his artisans while working in the tomb, which was never quite finished. When discovered in the 1920s, it still contained quite a bit of excavation chip. Down here, we have the antechamber, which is unfinished but beautifully decorated nevertheless, with work with parts of the books of the Book of the Dead on the walls, and the first ever astronomical ceiling in Egypt. This is the basic layout. So what you've got is a number of extracts from the Book of the Dead, along with a solar hymn, various liturgies also, many of which are found for the first time here, actually in a tomb. And the astronomical ceiling isn't found again in a tomb until the tomb of Seti I. So there's a number of things here which are seemingly royal elements, but there actually does seem to be something of a fuzzy line between royal and non-royal at this very point in time, because the Vizier Ussa, whose tomb we saw earlier on, being next door to Senenmut, had the Amduat in his burial chamber, the only private individual ever to have that. So I think what we're seeing during the time of Hatshepsut, Senenmut, Thutmose III, early part of, this is where a lot of New Kingdom funerary stuff is being developed, and exactly what goes where doesn't really become solid until a little bit later on. Here we have got the false door of Senenmut. Not something you'd normally expect to find in a burial part of a tomb, actually. But again, I think we're talking about very much a point where things are in flux and they're trying to work out what works and so on. Over here, we've got a nice little chunk of chapter 10 of the Book of the Dead. Well, so chapter 110 of the Book of the Dead. And then on the ceiling, we have this astronomical ceiling. Say, not known in a royal tomb until the beginning of the 19th dynasty. So anyway, that brings me to the end of this sort of very whistle-stop overview of the funerary monuments of Senenmut and Hatshepsut. Taken together, they represent a really interesting phase in the development of funerary stuff in New Kingdom Egypt. And I think also when one looks at things like the sarcophagi, I think that does allow us to say something meaningful about their relationship, even if one can't necessarily be definitive about such things. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Aidan. That was really interesting. I love these two statues here. I think Hatshepsut, some of her statues give you a real sense that she would actually have looked like her statue. There's something very individual about her statues, I think.
I think again we're talking about this period of the early Thutmose period, where they're moving away from the very conventional representations which were inherited from the Middle Kingdom to something more. So I would agree that, and also when you look at the portraits of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, who clearly as their close relations, they're very similar, but the sculptors made a point of making them sufficiently different that you can usually tell the difference between the two of them. So yeah, it's a really great period from the point of view of all sorts of things.
And I especially love this statue of Senenmut with Nefertiti as well. It's just a really beautiful, sort of sweet and gentle pose. It's interesting that you don't see Hatshepsut with her daughter so much as Senenmut.
No, well, I think again, it's not the sort of thing which, again, I think that there's a limit to what the sort of relaxations of Middle Kingdom sort of propriety as far as royal representation. And it's not until you get to Akhenaten that that close interaction between a king and offspring happens. But what's interesting is again, from the point of view of precedent, is that once Senenmut has done these series of statues with Nefertiti in them, that is then used by later individuals who are in a similar kind of tutorial role. So awful lot of things, I think, which are created during the Hatshepsut Senenmut sort of period are things which then become standard in Egyptian usage in later years.
Right, let me check the questions here. I think, Annette, did you want to say some words to your Ramases and Aidan crew? I think you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry. I do apologise for being late in, by the way. I had the gremlins on the computer today. So hello, Aidan. Nice to see you. Just want to say on behalf of the Society, thank you very much to our President, Aidan, for doing the lecture today. Much appreciated. Obviously for Ramases members, it's been a day today for us to remember our very beloved patrons. And now my brain's gone because Peggy and John, blimey, I see it's a bad day today. For me, I've been obviously trying to sort of picture Peggy and John walking around Hatshepsut's temple and telling us all the things and exciting bits. So it's been really nice to have a lovely memory for them, because obviously this is their memorial lecture that Aidan very kindly holds for us every year. So that has been lovely. And also welcome to all the other members. I've just had a scroll through and went through sort of 3 pages of people that are watching today, which is absolutely amazing. So you are very one popular gentleman, Aidan. So, but thank you very much indeed. Thoroughly enjoyed joining, even though I was a little bit late in joining in, but we look forward to seeing you again in person soon. And also, we will obviously be in discussion with the committee members as to where we progress later on in the year with lectures, whether they become at the Newington Hall or whether we continue on with Zoom for a little bit longer. But obviously it's something we are in discussion with at the moment, because obviously hopefully people are having their vaccinations, etc. But it's a case of just watch this space at the moment for RAMASES members who actually come to Newington. But that's my little bit. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Annette. Ros, I noticed that you were here today, and I was just wondering if you had any little golden nuggets of wisdom about Senenmut's astronomical ceiling. You need to unmute yourself, Ros.
Oh,
Thanks, Aidan.
I'm overwhelmed.
Sorry, Ros. I was talking to the other Ros. Rosalind Park gave a talk for the Explorers Club previously on astronomy and astrology in ancient Egypt, and I thought that might be a good person to bring in at this moment about that Senenmut's astronomical ceiling.
I'm afraid I don't have too much to say, in that what Aidan said, it was a forerunner before astronomical ceilings appeared in the 19th dynasty. It's curious. Christian lights suggested to Peter Dorman, which went in a footnote, that it could have been Senenmut's horoscope. And Peter Dorman didn't quite dismiss that. That raises a lot of questions, but I wouldn't put it past him. There's some reason for that. It's a datable astronomical thing.
Okay.
But I'm still figuring it out. I spent, good 20 years considering it, but I'm not ready to say anything lest I embarrass myself. But I love it. I absolutely love it. I always get excited to see it. Thank you, Aidan.
Is it going to be in your book, Ros?
Afraid not. I'm doing Ptolemaic. That's safe. That's really safe. Maybe if I get to book 2, certainly it'll be Senenmut. And, SETI I've figured out. That's quite exciting. But Senenmut really, why did he do it? What's it all about? Anyway, we'll see.
Actually, I've got the chat up. Shall I go through the questions rather than you having to read them out to me? I'll read them before I answer them.
Right,
Probably the easiest thing to do, yeah?
Yep, that'd be great. Thanks, Aidan.
Okay, first question, as far as I can see on here, is were all the mud brick buildings, the temples, masonry clad or only whitewashed on the outside? Where they're made of mud brick, normally we expect simply plaster and whitewash. So you wouldn't normally clad brick with stone, as far as one can normally tell. It's either stone or brick. You don't tend to get a composite of the two. Did Senenmut's mother have a title? No, Senenmut's mother has no title apart from Lady of the House, and his father has the title of worthy, nothing more than that, which suggests that Senenmut did indeed come from fairly humble stock. Yeah, he was never vizier or anything like that. He was overseer of works, a steward of a moon, and things like that. They were all there's no sort of titles from the main administration, if you like. Any images or name of Hatshepsut appear in either location of Senenmut? No images of Hatshepsut in either the tomb nor the chapel, as far as we can tell. So, as you can see, the walls of the chapel have been so badly trashed. It's possible she might have done. But on the other hand, in that period in the 18th dynasty, there is a location where you often find the king shown anyway. But unfortunately, the bit where you expect to possibly find him or her is totally trashed, unfortunately. Does Senenmut appear other than what may have been destroyed in Hatshepsut's complex or tomb? His main position in the temple is he is found in little reliefs behind doorways, some of which are intact, some of which aren't. I should have actually shown a picture of one of those. But yeah, that's the odd thing. He's often there, but hiding behind doorways, which again suggests his situation was sort of was irregular. It had been suggested that he put these in without the knowledge of the Queen. I'm sure she was perfectly aware, but this was possibly a way for him to be sort of present in her monument without drawing too much attention. I say, if they indeed were indeed life partners, the situation would have been very delicate simply because there was no real precedent for it. So I think that's probably what's going on there. As Amduat appears on walls for first time, was it found on papyri elsewhere? Any indication for its new enlarged importance in her monument? Well, as far as we can see, the Amduat does not exist prior to the time of Thutmose III. There's no examples of anything on any previous source, and the earliest examples are those in the tombs of Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and of the Vizier Ussa. So that's the starting point for the Amduat. It then goes through various sort of modifications over the next couple of centuries in its use in royal tombs, up until Amenhotep III. It's the only book of the underworld in any tomb. After Amarna, it gets mixed and matched with the gates and various other works, and then it appears for the first time in papyri, as far as we can see, in the 21st dynasty. Not normally in a full version, though there are a couple of them, but in that period you start getting almost compilation papyri, which contain bits from various different funerary works, and then those then carry on through into late period times. But that sort of the start of the playing with them and starting to use them in conjunction with other things, say, is post Amarna, and it's still all royal through until the 21st dynasty, when non-royals start having it on their papyri, which makes it even more sort of striking the fact that we've got the Vizier Ussa having it in his burial chamber. Again, it's important; it's in his burial chamber, not in his chapel. Where are we? Would the astronomical ceiling be a reflection of Senenmut being such a polymath? Very good question, but I think it's more to do with the era. I think it's quite an interesting intellectual era, and that's where it comes out of. And as somebody who is in the very core of what's going on in the country, Senenmut probably had therefore he decided to go for that idea. Ussa took the Amduat, and then it's only after all of this that things sort of settle down a little bit. So Sarah Simmons just given an excellent talk on the astronomical ceiling to the Toronto group. It appears to be a pretty good summary of New Kingdom view of astronomy. What would the best reading reference for these monuments? I think Peter Dorman, there are two books by Peter Dorman. There's his PhD thesis, which is called The Monuments of Senenmut, which, in addition to being on Senenmut's monuments, is still probably the best history of the reign of Hatshepsut there is. A little bit out of date now, but a brilliant book. And also there is his big volume on the tombs of Senenmut, which is long out of print, but you can actually download a PDF copy from the website of the Library of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's a bit difficult to navigate your way through, but it is in there. So those are the key things. And the other thing is the exhibition catalogue, the Hatshepsut exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York about 10 years ago, which shouldn't be too difficult to get hold of on ABE Books, I wouldn't have thought. As an exhibition catalogue, they tend to be quite a lot of them printed. So that's probably the two Dorman books and the Hatshepsut catalogue are key. Also, still a great read is Winlock's Excavations of Der el-Bahri volume, which sounds pretty dry, but Winlock, as some of you will be aware, was probably one of the finest writers in the English language to ever be an Egyptologist. And even his hard line stuff is really very, very nicely written. And it really gives you a feel for excavations in the 1920s. So Winlock's Excavations at Der el-Bahri is another goodie, which I would recommend. Let's have a look.
You were saying about Senenmut being credited with being Hatshepsut's architect, but is there any sources that actually communicate this idea, or is it?
It's pure that one of his titles is Overseer of Works.
Okay.
Which would then imply that he is working on the major monuments of Hatshepsut. So that's where it comes from. But whether or not you're actually being the architect and the overseer of works are the same thing is unclear. Although it's really only in more modern times that there is a clear dividing line between the person who designs something and the person who project manages it. I suspect there was probably, again, I suspect a lot of it was a bit of it was collective work by a number of individuals, but clearly with Senenmut must have been an important person in all this. Whether he was the architect, as he's often sort of rather loosely called, I think one has to be a little bit more nervous about.
Have you seen the Netflix series The Treasure, which does a nice Mills and Boon job on the Hatshepsut and Senenmut?
I have to try. I avoid anything sort of people prancing around in bed sheets on TV or film.
It was very funny. There was about I think there were about 6 timelines overlapping on it. It was very confusing to watch, but quite entertaining actually.
Yeah, just one little thing I was spotted. Thanks. The area of Der el-Bahri was an important destination during the beautiful Festival of the Valley. Remains of reliefs in the inner, north, and east walls of the upper terrace. Was there a good reason for Hatshepsut having episodes of the festival depicted on the southern part of the same wall? Honestly, we have no idea because we simply don't. We don't have the data to go on. The trouble is, we've got these things present at Der el-Bahri. If we had the walling of Thutmose III surviving, or Amenhotep II and so on following on, we have a better idea of why some of this stuff may be going on. Quite honestly, we just at this stage, because we've got the Der el-Bahri temple, and then lots of not very much. It's almost impossible to be able to make sort of theories as to why this is, apart from possibly a desire for the to be part of for the temple almost to be a microcosm of what's going on the West Bank, possibly, but don't really know.
Some of the new innovations have come from influence from Mesopotamia or Greece, especially with things like the astronomical ceiling.
Possibly, but again, we can't be sure of it. It's sort of one of these things where it's a reasonable guess. So it's quite a good guess, but we can't actually prove it. That's the trouble is one can have lots of nice sort of theories about where things came from, but there's never the sort of a smoking gun to be able to be absolutely certain that is actually the case, rather than simply a bright idea we were having in modern times. Oh, another one's just come up. Would the same size of Senenmut's figure in his tomb with regard to the figure of Hatshepsut's figure on the wall give a hint of their relationship? We don't actually have. There's no examples I can think of where the two of them are actually shown together. The figures are all in where you've got in Hatshepsut's buildings are all in subsidiary locations. So, and they're all much smaller scale. So I don't think there's anything which we can pick on in iconography or anything. And they're certainly never shown together in the same scene.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Aidan before we let him go for the afternoon? think that's it. I think we're done. Thank you so much, Aidan. That was really interesting.
Great stuff. Okay.
And thank you so much to everyone for coming along.
Indeed, likewise, and say hopefully see you all in person for the next one of these presidential lectures. But all we can do is just wait and see what happens. Anyway, cheers all.
Thank you.
I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much for coming. Bye.
Bye.